for the formal session. He's tied up in a business commitment. Before we start business, I believe this will be the most enjoyable thing I do today. It's my pleasure to present a 10-year pin to one of our appointees, Amanda. And as you know, Amanda has been with us now 10 years and recently got promoted to clerk, and we want to sincerely thank you for what you do to support us, not only today, but what you did over the years ahead.
Thank you, sir. I appreciate it.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Okay, we'll start with interim financial statements.
Okay.
Yes, sir. Well, Patty's here, and she's going to roll.
Okay. Good afternoon, Mayor, members of council. In your package on Friday, you should have received the written booklet on the status of the city's funds at January 31st. And we're going to go over just very, very high level on the general fund here today. We're going to go over the revenues, expenditures, and where we're going to go from here. This one slide, if you wanted to have one slide, this tells in a nutshell where we are at the end of January. We have actual revenues of $523 million versus a $1,129 million budget. It means we still have $606 million to go, and here we are at the end of January. City operations, we have spent $727 million against an expenditure budget of $1,195.7 million. Of course, the difference between the revenue and expenditure budget is from fund balance. Thank you. With the rubber chip here. This slide is just going to remind us that we still have a ways to go. The way our revenues come in is weighted to the end of the fiscal year, and that's why it's important to maintain a fund balance. I just read a rating agency report 2 minutes before I came down here, and they talked about that. We have collected $523 million, $40 million more than last year. Some of that is a tax increase, some of that's assessment increase, and some of that's a redirection of revenues going to other funds in the past. First half, the real estate tax was collected in December. Business license are due next month, which is an annual tax. It's a large dollars, $46.8 million. Personal property and annual tax, $102 million budget due in June. That is where it'd be better if it were able to be spread, but it's not. And of course, the second half of real estate taxes due. So a lot of revenue still to collect. Now, this section of the briefing, I'm going to focus on just some of the big revenue items the way we usually do. These blue bars are the annual revenues collected since 2012. These orange bars are through January of each year to kind of see where we stand on a trend line. And of course, the line is the percent of actual or percent of budget. The yellow is this year's budget, $521.9 million for just the general fund. And we're at 53.1%. We are doing just fine. Personal property tax, again, it's an annual tax, so we don't really have much collected. Most of that $21 million is actual delinquents, people that did not pay last June but paid in the current fiscal year. We don't know what the assessed values will be for this June yet. We don't have that information. That will be maybe another 2 months. Sales tax, we've collected 1.7% more than we collected last year at the same time. The budget is substantially higher, so it's too early to tell whether we'll actually make that budget. Total hotel room taxes, $26.2 million. That's a 10% up, but remember, that includes an additional $1 a room night that was in effect last January for the first time. So if you take away that, we're maybe 2 to 3% up. We're still up. I put this little chart here to help council remember where all the pieces of this hotel tax go. And I won't go into that. Total restaurant meal tax, we've collected more, up 1.1%. Budget has gone up a lot, so it's a little too soon to say whether we'll make that budget. Again, this little chart is a reminder where the pieces of the meal tax go. This chart, if you wanted to cut it out and put it in your pocket, if you are like me, who work in it every day, to remember where the hotel and meal tax go, this would be a good chart. This is sort of a summary of the revenues. The green, real estate, personal property are ahead of the prior year, as is federal revenues. Telecommunications tax is a little bit down, as is cigarette taxes, not materially a portion of the overall revenue picture. And of course, human services charges are down, but that's a reimbursement issue, so it's not of any concern at this stage.
Is that principally Medicaid reimbursements?
A lot of it, yeah. Expenditures broken down by expenditure category, not by department, not just by category. Compared to last year, we've spent $55.5 million more. Between salaries and fringes, it's almost $10 million more. Transfer to schools, another $10 million. And then capital projects, $34 million more than prior year, 10 which came from the multimodal fund. So a lot went into capital projects. This chart is the one I like to, because it shows our expenditure trend line is doing real good with this light green compared to the red, and our revenue chart is doing well with the bright blue versus the purple. But it also illustrates we have a lot to catch up to close the gap between the two. But we always do. We'll be back next month with the same information.
Thank you very much, Patty. Any questions of Patty? Yes, John. Go
One,
ahead.
I want to thank you for breaking out in the transmittal letter the difference between the tax increase and the base. That was very appreciated.
Thank you.
Do we know by chance how much, if any, influence people prepaying their
Yes.
property tax to take a collection?
I
looking
forgot to
back?
mention, that was a ratio. You know, when last month you asked me the question, at that point I couldn't see it. We do see over $6 million more that was posted in January. You know, if you're going to write a check, you're going to write it the last day of the month, dated December 31st. So it gets processed during January, and so we did see about $6 million more.
Pretty substantial. Thank you very much.
Yeah,
Thank
and before I close, I wanted to recognize Kevin Kilbasa, one of our senior accountants, Taylor Adams, operations manager, of course, Jeff Radarmal is risk management, Miriam Woodson, principal accountant, and of course, Don Barnett, comptroller.
We thank all of y'all for your help and coming over here. Appreciate it. Great job y'all are doing every day. All right, we'll move on. The results of the citizen survey. David Bradley.
Yes, sir. They're going to come in. David's going to do the introduction, and we have a new consultant on board for this year's citizen survey. So, Mr. Bradley.
Okay,
Good
David,
afternoon,
glad to
City
have you
Council.
here.
Thank you. You know, we've been doing this survey since 1995, roughly every 2 years, and all cities want metrics, particularly budget offices, and we're good at getting input and output measures, you know, counting widgets, so to speak, but getting good outcome data is something that we all strive for. And, you know, we got this update for you. I want to recognize Jonathan Hobbs and Crystal Skinner and Julie Hill. We were all part of the committee and the internal staff that worked with our new consultant, which is Issues and Answers Network Incorporated. They've done this type of work across the country and internationally, and they're a local firm. They've been in Virginia Beach for 30 years or so. So I am going to introduce Peter McGinnis, who will start off the presentation.
Great. Thank you, David. Peter, we welcome you, sir.
Thank you. All right, I'm just going to be, that I understand we want to move through very quickly. Victor Crane is one of our chief analysts and statisticians. He's worked tirelessly on this study, knows it better than anybody, so he's going to do the presentation. Happy to say that, yeah, thank you, almost 30 years. April 1st will be here 30 years, and I've known Will that long. So anyway, so without further ado, Victor.
Peter, thank you very much. Victor, we're glad to have you.
I understand we're on the clock for this, so I'll try to make this fairly quick. If there are any questions,
We'll have questions at the end.
very good, sir.
Very good.
Okay, let me go right into the clicker brief. We're going to talk. I'm just going to go through this very quickly. You have the presentation. I assume you have questions. They'll come up at the end, so let's leave time for that. I'm just going to go through and touch the highlights on these charts. The purpose of the survey, again, is to assess how residents feel about living in Virginia Beach and about city services. We conducted most of the data collection was in December, and the analysis took a good part of the time of January. This is our first time to be in here. The survey was about 3 minutes shorter than the last time it was run, 16.1 minutes on average. We completed 500 interviews. The typical margin of error on average is 4.4%. You may have a question about that later. We weighted the data to ensure projectability. Everything we talk about in the report is statistically significant at least the 95% level. And of course, there is a detailed report, which I think most of you have seen. Now, Virginia Beach receives very high scores. I say that comfortably because I've taken the time over the last few weeks to go through published reports that other cities that we haven't worked with have put up on site, as well as published papers from other research companies. There seems to be a general consensus that the 80% level on satisfaction is the target everyone seems to use within the industry. But your scores, your overall satisfaction is up in 90%, and that's exceedingly rare. I can't say definitively that you're the only city that scores that high, but there's very few of them that are close.
We're the greatest city in the world. We probably are the only one.
I thought someone might make that comment. I wasn't sure who. Anyway, historically, satisfaction scores fluctuate a bit. We've came up with a different format for reporting data this year so you can differentiate easily normal fluctuation versus things that are unusual that might be worth paying attention. And the biggest area, the one that people most like to complain about is traffic. But as we'll talk about in a second, when we did statistical modeling on how perceptions of traffic affect attitudes about living in Virginia Beach or attitudes about city services, they don't. They have no impact. So people care about, it's almost like the weather. People like to complain about traffic, but when it comes down to how does it affect their feelings about living in Virginia Beach, it doesn't. How does it affect their feelings about the city? It doesn't, at least not now. We use the same 4-point scale that have been used in past reports. Again, I'm not going to spend a lot of time. We don't have much time. Okay, overall satisfaction with city services. This is a summary question after we run through a litany of 32 different services or features of the city. A feature is something like appearance of the city, which is not a distinct service, as opposed to police, fire, public libraries. And we have a blow up of this chart on the next page. What we did in this format, it's called a control chart format, is we take the theory that there's been no change in the data. We establish a global average score for the entire period. We put upper and lower confidence intervals around that score, and then we see if the data stays within those intervals. If it does, any kind of random variation in there doesn't matter. Doesn't indicate anything's changed. If it goes out, and a couple charts will show you, go out, then it indicates there might be something we might want to spend a little time thinking about. The score here on overall satisfaction with city services is very high, and it really hasn't moved since 2003. And that would be the conclusion from that chart. And that is impressively high. These are the top rated services. And, okay, thank you. And as you can see, at the very top is a fire department and the public libraries. Well, the three top, all 98% are fire department, public libraries, and paramedic services. Again, I'm not going to read the list for you. You have it. These are impressive scores. Again, most of 18 of the 32.
I wasn't going to have any questions to Liam, but a police department being in the 90% at this day and time, isn't that pretty strong?
Yeah, it is.
I would think that would have to be extremely strong here nationwide. Thank you.
Yeah, the short answer is, from everything I've seen, yes, it is.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. Anyway, those are services that have the ratings of 90% or higher. These are in the good category. They've got ratings between 80 and 90%. Appearance matters to people. I'll talk about that more in a moment. But these are all good scores. They're not fantastic, but they're good. You're over the 8% threshold. Then we get down to the list of items that aren't quite there. At the very top, the top 3 items are within standard error of 80%, so we can't really say that they're below 80%. Beyond that, from job opportunities on down to traffic at the very bottom, we have things that people say they are less thrilled with traffic at the bottom. What's changed since the last survey in 2015? And I've got to admit, I'm a newbie. I'm in the process of transferring down here from New Jersey. I'm not a longtime resident of, as Peter is, or many of my colleagues are.
Well, then you're in Nirvana.
That is true.
The city's, we've got increases in scores for drinking water, wastewater collection, and for overall appearance of the city. Okay, I don't know if there's any particular event that transpired to cause those scores to go up. The rest of the scores have all shifted somewhat in the negative, although they're still pretty strong. The 911 phone center has slipped from 95.9 to 90. 90% is still excellent, but it's a slip. Courtesy of city's employees has gone from 91 to 85.8. Again, 85.8 is a good score, but it's a slip. So you can look at this and say, traffic is just traffic. Okay. We also asked a series of questions about perceptions of living in Virginia Beach. This is slide 13. Virginia Beach is a good place to live. That score stays up in the 90s. It hasn't changed significantly. I can conveniently access city services. That's up in the 90s. Hasn't changed. Houses in my neighborhood are well maintained. That's actually gone up a fraction, but it's not a statistically significant change. Virginia Beach in general is a safe place to live. Has slipped from 94 to 88%. 88% is still high, but it's a slip. My neighborhood is a safe place to live. We'll have more about that on the next page. The roads are too congested. Yeah, people are more likely to agree than 2 years ago that the roads are too congested. And overall, I received good value for my tax dollar. That's 75% now. It was 80%. Not a huge change, but a slight change. And I know how to inform the city about the way I feel on important issues. That's basically unchanged. The safety issues I wanted to flag here because we noticed when we were doing these charts that we had kind of a trend. My neighborhood is a safe place to live. In 2003 it was 96.4. In 2017 it's 86.4. So it's been kind of a 10-point slide. It looks like one of the not quite as bad as the ski slopes in the Olympics, but yeah, it's a consistent trend. Virginia Beach in general is a safe place to live. Stayed very static up until this year when it fell out of the typical range. We'll see with the next survey whether that's a meaningful change, implies a new normal. Yeah, our perceptions of the neighborhoods catching up with the city. Don't know what the prompting for this is. Again, we're dealing with perceptions here, not crime statistics. And perceptions can be based on a lot of different things. What you read on Nextdoor, what you hear. My temporary housing down here is just across the border in Norfolk. I hear gunshots at night. I assume people on the western edges of Virginia Beach can hear them too. And we had verbatim comments in the report about them. But people don't know where they're coming from. I know they're coming from the neighborhood I'm living in right now. So, some of it's a spillover, maybe a spillover from Norfolk.
But if I could interject for a moment.
Sure.
A point to keep in mind is safety is a much broader term. We're not just talking about crime. It could be flooding. It could be houses hit by lightning. There's a combination of things come under the umbrella of safety.
Mm-hmm. And we have to take that score in conjunction with the high regard for the police. Okay, but there is a concern there. It's probably worth spending a little bit of time to try to explore, dig down into what the concern is. There are some verbatims in the report that talk about it. Okay. The areas that had the lower scores on Virginia Beach is a safe place to live. This is the oceanfront area. This is Lansdowne, oceanfront Lansdowne. The highest areas was Bayside in terms of the highest level of satisfaction on those issues. So there's some variation,
I say.
consistent variation there.
Always about Bayside.
Okay, and what else do we have here? Okay, that was what we just had, 16. I did some statistical analysis, regression analysis to try to determine what issues we measured in the survey were most closely linked to satisfaction with living in Virginia Beach. These are the items that fell out of the model. I did a similar model for overall satisfaction with city services. Those are the items that fell out in the model. You notice the traffic isn't in either list. It was included in the statistical design, but it fell out as inconsequential. We asked a open-ended question about what could be done to make Virginia Beach a better place to live. Now, 25% of our response basically gravitated back to traffic, and they talked about potholes, they talked about traffic flow. There are a host of other issues mentioned by clusters of response. These aren't one-offs. These are things that we have 10 or 20 or 30 respondents mentioning within the survey as areas of importance. And some of the verbatims which are included in the detailed report are actually quite interesting. Okay, let's see, where are we? This chart concerns communicating with residents. The key media for communicating with residents is the city website, vb.gov.com, and then the TV news and TV news websites. Those are the most commonly used media, by folks in the community. Interesting point. The question was raised. Well, we did the survey. Is how do people feel about the amount of information the city is providing them? We had 65% saying they're very happy with what the city's giving them. We had 27% saying they'd like more. We had 1% saying they'd like less. Almost nobody's saying that the city is overloading them with information. So, if anything, they'd like to err on the throw more at us side of things. Citizen participation. We did ask what people in our survey have done within the past year. And most of them visited public beach. Most of them, visited parks, museum, or aquarium, library, rec center. Had contact with the city in some form. And we did break out the satisfaction scores by contact. In most cases, there's no difference. The public library's got the same rating, regardless of whether people have been there or not. The police department got a 5-point lower rating if someone actually had contact with them than they did among people who had no contact with the police. That's not a surprise. You get a traffic ticket, you're not going to be happy. And so, basically, the wrap up: you've got a population that really loves living here. They've got very high scores for the city for living in Virginia Beach. You've got a potential. The things that are worth concern: lack of awareness in the community about some city efforts, working with our communities, environmental concerns. We had a lot of people giving don't know responses. We asked them to rate that, simply telling us that they didn't have enough information to be able to answer the question. Traffic management, yes, people do complain about it. Maybe in the future it will become a more salient issue with people. Right now it's something they like to talk about. And again, this entire safety thing, the scores are all high. they're still high, very high at this point, but is there a emerging issue going forward? What's the next wave of the survey going to show us?
Great. Thank you very much. Questions or comments, John?
Schools, I know we've asked about this last year. You know, if you look at our police, everything's like 90%. The one thing we put money behind and invest in after public safety is our public schools.
That was
They,
84%, I believe.
yeah, they do rank fairly well and competitive against benchmarks. There's always room for improvement. But what do the detailed comments, you know, say? I'm interested in, that could be later, but I'm very much interested in understanding what that feedback is, because you would think that schools, as a general rule, would be equal to or greater than a police department. You would think, you know, just in my mind, it might be the wrong answer, but I'd be interested to know what in a detailed report, what some of the narratives were. And do you have a chart that shows a 10-year of the schools as well?
Yeah, we do, actually. I don't have it with me. I didn't include the presentation.
I'd like to see that, because I think that's worth.
That's in the report.
But we need to share that with the schools, and I'd be interested, you know, at a later date, just for them sharing back the right way as to where that gap is, because I think we need to understand it.
Great.
Okay.
Any other questions or comments? We certainly do.
I did have one question. I noticed, you know, the 2, 3, 4, 5, 7 is brown, and that's because it was such a small sample. So is there any way that we have, or any?
We had 7 respondents there. There's such a small.
How those people are feeling?
Nothing reliable on that sample size. Okay, if we have the opportunity next time around to increase the sample size in each of the zip code areas, so we have a better, but there the population, we only had about 1,000 people in that area anyway to work with. So 1,500 or whatever the number was, I don't remember the exact figure, but it's very small relative to everything else. You've got a city population that's 450,000, and you've got just a less than 1% in that area. So we'd have to do some stratified sampling to get more detail on that area.
Any other questions or comments? We're delighted to have a Virginia Beach company doing the research, and we thank you for that. And to the council, thank you all for y'all's hard work and the staff as well. Everyone's hard work to make sure we have numbers like that. It's not easy to come by.
And I apologize. I think I went a little bit over my 15 minutes.
It does resonate with our road bond referendum.
I picked up on that. All right, we'll move on. Thank you all very much for coming down.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
We'll now go to the Pier term sheet. Ron H. Williams, Jr.
Good afternoon, Mayor, members of council.
Good afternoon, Ron.
Let's see, Julie's got me teed up here. Great. Okay.
Oh, you've got the bachelor pictures in here.
So council, as a reminder, just a little bit of background, and for those watching, the city, at least the records we have in the city manager's office, is discussions for the idea of developing a new pier started as far back at least as 2010, and definitely in earnest in 2014. And that came during the renewal of the franchise agreement for the existing pier. And then in 2016, the city received communications about a grander vision with the assemblage of properties around the pier area, and discussions started over those January 2016, and then have been shared with you, and liaisons were appointed to start to flesh out the idea of that grander vision. And so that's what brings us this evening to look at a path forward for a pier project. But speaking of the existing pier, yes, it was featured prominently on ABC last night as part of the Bachelor show. The couple that was here was on the boardwalk. They were Rudy Marina. They rode horses on the beach. They were in the top of the lighthouse, but they also dined at Ocean Eddies on the pier as part of that. And then they went on to the young lady's parents' home here at the beach. So it was nice to get that little commercial for Virginia Beach, and it was a nice 3 or 4 or 5 minutes that on there. So, so what's the purpose of this project? The purpose of what we're have been considering and recommending for this vision that's been laid out the past couple years is to construct a new city-owned pier north of the existing pier at 15th Street, aligned with 15th Street, across a public beach, connected to the boardwalk with a connector, public connector park to Atlantic Avenue. And that public parking should be available in close proximity, and that knowing the opportunity that is there and considering that there is existing restaurant and some retail on there, that we would encourage at least a $40 million topside improvements to densify the project. And so we looked at different ways to achieve that. There are different procurement methods. And understanding that you do have an arm, a partner in the development authority of the city that has done public-private partnerships and or infrastructure before. And so the suggestion that the VBDA could provide you a sublease opportunity to have an operator for the pier, and that they also could manage the development of a development agreement in order to achieve a public-private partnership. You could achieve the public park through a dedication of an access easement because the property that's at the existing pier is private, and that public parking can be acquired as part of a development agreement in close proximity on private property as well. A couple other elements to a process to achieve this is that so we did, looking for that opportunity because required by Virginia Code, a lease to the Development Authority cannot come automatically from the council. You must solicit that even from the Development Authority. So we did solicit a lease bid opportunity. We received the response from the Development Authority and one other, and I'll come back to that, that you could then have a term sheet and development agreement. We would recommend public engagement on the pier design and the elements in there, in particular the parking and other public amenities of the parks and the uses on there. And then that ultimately you could end up with a development agreement for the construction and the public-private partnership. So the pier project terms that we're laying out this evening are based on that vision that was first received in 2016, but evolved some and better terms, and that's why they're being considered now. And basically that is the basic cost of an 880-foot public pier at $21.5 million, which would include demolition of the existing pier, utilities, lighting, et cetera, what you would think that would be in a project. And then that also, that basic pier has a fishing element, which could be for a fee component, and it may or may not be a double structure, but that's the intention, is that for this amount, you have a pier that's open and free to the public, but also there's a fishing opportunity. And then the recommendation for spaces, public parking spaces associated with it. Again, the recommendation that a public park connect the boardwalk to Atlantic Avenue, requirement of topside improvement, and how this would be achieved is through a lease to VBDA, subleasing then to an operator who would be responsible for the routine operational maintenance, and then only major capital would be a city responsibility. And at the end of a 40-year term, the city would actually own the pier and the topside improvements outright. So the proposed pier dimensions are similar to the existing pier, a little bit longer. The existing pier is 160 feet, so this is a little bit longer. It also has elements that are similar to, if anyone's seen the Jeanette's Fishing Pier down at Nag's Head. You do have existing retail food and beverage here, but this would be that 40 million. That size would be about the level of a $40 million investment of about 60,000 square feet. So the potential of that greater vision that was there, that's been laid out, of the public-private development, is that there's upwards of $200 million potential investment on the pier and the adjacent property. So the idea of a 200-foot high sky entertainment wheel, which is not the open seat Ferris wheel type. It's the pods or the gondola type where several people sit in there. So it is a very large wheel. A 60,000 square foot of some mix of commercial, entertainment, retail, restaurant to replace what's there, and then some additional public restrooms, the idea of a surfing museum or of Hall of Fame, whichever it evolves to. And then the idea that there's the potential for 2 hotel towers. One that would be potential for upper upscale, and the other either another hotel or timeshare. And that there would be a consideration of some tourism development financing because of that upper upscale hotel and the entertainment amenities that are on the pier. So as I mentioned, of course, we fully expected that this transaction, this procurement method of using the Development Authority, that procedurally the Development Authority did have to respond. You have copies of that response, which is in keeping with the type of response we would expect to receive from this type of solicitation. And so, of course, the intention there is that the Development Authority would lease and then sublease through the negotiated development agreement for a developer and operator for the pier. We also received a letter from Wool Services Supply and Logistics LLC. I'll refer to it as WSSL from here out. The response is the one-page response is in your package, and it was not evident who the company was or what experience they had. So we did ask for some follow-up qualifiers to understand what's the ability to actually deliver a project of this nature. So we asked for additional information on elements of the pier, for the anticipated cost of the improvements, source of funds that's both intended to be both public and private. So mention if there was public participation, if there was previous projects that WSSL LLC had completed and evidence of their capacity to actually deliver this type of project, and then identification of development partners or who was their potential team for architectural contractor and engineer, and then identification of associated development to be completed with the pier. So this is in comparison to what had been considered before as the grander vision. The response that we received provided a couple of nuggets of information, but in most cases, questions 1, 4, 5, and 6, there weren't details that actually answered the question. Number 2, they're lifting from the letter, no anticipated cost of the improvements, yet they did mention what had been discussed here previously or in the media at a $18 to $25 million range, the cost of the pier. And then there wasn't any reference to private funding in the response to number 3. However, they did reference the use of the TIP fund would be their recommendation. So based on that, yes, sir, you have that.
Okay.
Yes, sir. So it is 2 or 3 pages, and most of where it says provided no details, they reference their one-page response to the lease solicitation. So there wasn't any more elaboration on the question. So next steps in our staff recommendation, based on what we've seen to date, we would recommend proceeding with a lease agreement with VBDA, and that a term sheet be finalized for both VBDA and your consideration. We would recommend that the timing for that, because the VBDA also meets on the same date, would be March 20th.
Thank you very much, Ron. John Earn? I just had a technical question, Mr. Mayor, if I could. Ron, if you go to slide 8, of the potential public-private development, where it said the approximate $200 million worth of private sector investment. I assume that includes not just the second deck of the pier, but also includes the landside development as well?
Correct.
Okay. But then when you drop down, it says not to exceed 60,000 square feet of commercial, entertainment, retail, and a restaurant space. Is that include on the land side and the pier, or is that only a pier only?
That's topside improvements to the pier.
Okay, so it's just a mix between the two. Okay. All right. Oh, and the other technical question, if I could, Mr. Mayor, the current.
Oh, and then hotel.
So
yeah.
hold on.
Yeah.
This was a point of order that I engaged Mr. Thompson on with regards to what he was really projecting, and did that include what he was going to include into the hotels? And he admitted that, yes, it includes all new, both topside and associated with the 2 towers.
Okay, but the 60,000 square feet is, the top one assumes the full development,
but the bottom one, or the 60,000 square feet only includes the top side of the pier.
Topside and whatever would be in the two towers.
In the two,
So it doesn't-
in the two
So it
towers.
includes landside and.
Yes.
Okay,
Includes everything east of Atlantic Avenue, let's put it that
okay,
way.
all right, well, so it's not all on the pier then, the
No,
60,000, okay.
no, it is not.
And then, Mr. Mayor, my other question too is, the truncated length of the pier as it sits there today with the pieces that have been chunked off, what is the length of it?
Today, it's 860, this proposed 860 feet.
It currently is 860.
Yes, sir.
And what was it originally before it got chunked off, do we know?
I'll have to find that out for you if I can.
I'm just trying to ascertain as to whether or not we're gonna have we would have a bigger pier than what we had.
At this design, it's 20 feet longer.
Only 20 feet.
Yes, sir.
Okay, all right, thank you.
Bobby D. This is a tough one for me, and I can hopefully say that my opposition to this project doesn't cost me some long-established relationships that I've had with this council over years. And just be mindful that my thoughts are based on principle that I have maintained for going on 14 years. I have an extreme problem with the process that is involved with this project. And I really need an explanation about why this project is being fast-tracked and giving priority over all the other projects that we got in the queue at the oceanfront, but then also that we got going on in the city. And to understand that the day before we had our retreat, an email went out talking about moving forward with a convention hotel, which was, I know I wasn't there the second day, but once again, another project out there without discussion, okay? Yeah, there was an email sent. I can get you a copy of it. The problem is, what criteria, Mr. Hanson, was used that this project is being so fast-tracked? And the other thing that I am told that was being said out on the stump, that this project is being fast-tracked because, it's been in the queue for years now. This is an information what we have on a briefing on a term sheet. There is no detail, there is no information in this that gives us any indicator of the financial impacts of what this project is going to cost and how it is going to adversely impact all the other dome site projects and everything else that we got in queue right here, okay? And the misnomer that's being said that this is a complementary to the other projects, I refuse to believe that. In my opinion, and I have maintained this point of order for years, how can we create city-sponsored competition, a pier where we put businesses on that are not only going to compete with the businesses around the corner, but throughout the city? And, the point is, though, I just find this incomprehensible that the city would take on this, and I think they're talking about a Coyote Ugly as one of the businesses. That, see, there's all kinds of rumors and speculation out there because we're not getting any. From what I understand, information is very hard to get on this project, okay? And the point is, though, if people are going to a city-sponsored venue like that, they're not going to Abbey Road, they're not going to Peabody's, they're not going. So this is displacement. Where is the studies on the displacement? Where are the studies on the actual impact of this project that is being fast-tracked through at breakneck speed? Where the other, the arena had to go through 5 years of microscopic examination. The Pier project has to go through a significant amount of scrutiny, public engagement, and everything. When did we have our public engagement? We had a public hearing when there was no information provided to even this council. We had a lease agreement go out on a project that hasn't been approved yet. What's wrong with this picture? And I apologize for my emotion, but this is why I ran for office back in 2004.
Thank you, Bobby. John?
Well, I ditto this sentiment. I wish we would have done a PPA process when the first unsolicited proposal came in. I think all of us would feel better if we went out and said, we got this idea, let's take 90 days and get all the ideas anywhere on the ocean front. Why here? But I'm going to get germane to where the council's decision is, though I do object to the process that we have, but I will focus on the specifics and respect the people's time. if you go back and to the slide that says proposed Pier project, is the 175 parking spaces, is that a ceiling? Is that a floor? Is that a potential that we can or cannot exercise? I'm just trying to walk down. So what's that 175 park? Since this is informational, so we're making no decisions, and so you asked for direction, but we can't provide it in any of our protocol, so I'm not asking to provide direction, but I'm just trying to understand, is the 175 parking spaces just a place marker? Just what does that represent in a future term sheet we are going to receive?
It relates principally to the traffic flow associated with the pier and not the hotel and not additional resort parking associated with a Central Beach resort parking strategy.
Will the term sheet preclude in the process, because if you look at this timeline, I'm just watching this timeline you have here, there's no dates, but it's just a step process. During that step process, would there be the opportunity that 175 doesn't represent the max that we would do, but is there a max that the structure would support? And would the term sheet say you can buy not less than 175 if you're going to buy any, but you can co-sponsor as many as another 300? I'm just trying to look at the range. Are we binding ourselves that that's the most we can get?
No,
I'm
sir.
just trying to ask that.
They have asked that a ceiling be put on us. We can ask up to 500, and we have said that we are still working on our Central Beach, but
Fair
they
enough.
have given us a ceiling, and they have agreed to a cost not to exceed $20,000 per space in a structured format.
In the required 60-foot wide public park, earlier it was referenced as an easement, not a park. So does the easement mean it's just a physical space that people can transit? Or in that 60-foot wide public easement, now called a park, is there ability for people to remain stationary or to put improvements? Or is it just a transit easement, much as you see in California, access to the beach? When you say public park and easement, what does that mean?
I think that the concept you bring up from a transit perspective, I think that would be their view of it. We have discussed the opportunity to do some additional space to create a park. We're not putting that in at this point. They are going to give us a 12-month option to rededicate our current rights-of-way associated with 14th Street, and we could transfer that rights-of-way into this, and if so, they would add an additional $1.5 million in contributed private investment for the creation of a public park rather than a transit way as you described.
Well, I just want to make sure I had covered
Yes, sir.
that. The next piece asks is then, but currently as this is laid out, we are not closing 14th Street, which would require 9 votes, correct?
That is correct.
Or does this proposal, in the event that there's not 9 votes, and there probably is not, is there any, does this involve any encroachment on the public street at 14th Street, which is an encroachment versus a transfer? Will there be any encroachments on 14th Street as it exists today?
If an encroachment was approved, it would, of course, not be structural. It would be surface only and in the same conformity that you have established precedents in the past.
That would be identified in the formal term sheet to come.
And it would require council approval.
Right, but it would be in the term sheet that we're going to actually get to look at. This is just an informational, but the decisional term sheet, that would be identified and specified?
We could, if that's where it goes.
Okay.
Yes, sir.
That's all the questions I had on that page. If we go to the next one, please. Now, if I remember right, the gap financing bill says you can't receive gap financing if there is a public infrastructure improvement. I believe that is correct. Is that correct?
It's a consideration factor, but it is not a prohibition.
Because this gets back to Bobby's point. We are making a $25 million public investment to enable a $40 million private investment for competitive businesses. So I think that is a good point. Now, I would like to come back because I was confused in the end. Is the 60,000 square feet on the pier exclusively or not?
It is not. It includes the investment inside the hotels as well.
Is there a minimum square footage or just a dollar maximum that's required? Because here at the top side on this page said they have to spend $40 million on the top side improvements. but there's no specification of that square footage. And is there a square footage minimum that the term sheet will require, or just an expenditure of money?
Maximum.
So it's just a dollar value?
It's a maximum of square footage, no more than 60,000.
Well, yeah, but 60
Total for the project, and a minimum of 40 million on top of the pier.
Right, but what I'm asking is, if they did no improvements in the hotel or anywhere else, then they could put 60,000 square feet on the pier. So really what you're telling me, in the term sheet, there's no prescribed minimum square footage on the top side of the pier, only a maximum that could be on the pier if it wasn't used anywhere else. Is that correct?
I think so.
Okay,
Yes,
I'll just
sir.
make sure I do my math right. Is there anything that's going to talk about the minimum square footage of the public restroom, and will that be a public expense, or is that something the developer in consideration for the exclusive subleasing of the property is going to provide?
I think we would want to specify that in the development agreement, which would be the binding document. And in the term sheet, it would just be an item that has to be included. Non-binding, as you know, a term sheet
Right.
is.
In their
Yes, sir.
unsolicited proposal, they identified a minimum number of parking spaces, which I won't quote here, not want to violate anybody's, that they were going to provide for the hotel and the tower. As everyone might not know, there's no requirement east of Atlantic Avenue for a hotel to provide parking for employees. Will the term sheet specify, when we get the final term sheet, specify the total parking, and will that parking requirement also require them to include employees for parking, so that the 175 spaces we provide are not the employee parking spaces? Will it address that?
Yes, sir. And I might add that the total parking structure, they don't want to exceed, I think they put a limit of 1,000 spaces to associate with there. So the difference between what they've given us and what they're telling us between 900 and they haven't done that
I
pre-engine.
understand, I'm just asking in the end, because you don't have to specify the numbers, but you can have a performance number, that the number that they provide will equal the number required by the public spaces that have weddings and rooms, plus employees. You don't have to specify the number, you can calculate later, but the term sheet can relate to the fundamental they have to meet. And my last, will the gap finance, and I've heard some rumblings, and it's just rumor, that the stuff that's on the west side of Atlantic Avenue that they're looking to improve, that's existing structure, so I assume that that definitely is a pre-existing facility. Is that also be included in the gap financing proposal that we're making?
Negative. The council liaisons have been very adamant about stating that sales tax revenue generated for TDFP can only come on the east side of Atlantic because of the pre-existing condition of the shops that exist on the west side.
And the last two are just confirming questions. Going back to the process steps, there's no dates on these, just the process steps, that since today's just an informational briefing, we have this, so where in here will the term sheet come back to us on your calendar? I know it says approved lease agreement and term sheet, but I hope that so are we going to get both the lease agreement and the term sheet at some future date, and when do you anticipate that to be?
I would recommend to the council, we have an action to do on the lease agreement to the Development Authority.
March 20th, that's the recommendation.
And there'll be ample time probably received between the time we receive it, which will be Friday, probably at 5 p.m., or at your front doorstep. Hopefully it's not the next Tuesday we're voting, because people might like to read that, and I like to read everything, as people know, and there's only so many hours in a day.
In response, let's say our recommendation is that we bring you the lease agreement with the Development Authority on the 20th, but unless the terms are agreed to and the liaisons are comfortable and they can represent it before the council, I guarantee you I'm going to get that lease worked out, because we're still in the throes, and we will have another briefing put on the agenda that gives it to you in advance, and we'll walk those terms in much more detail than today.
I'm in no hurry. I would prefer that you take the time required to make it as thorough as possible, so I only have to read it once.
Yes, sir.
Now I have one last question, if I could.
Certainly.
I've tried to keep them very targeted questions.
You have.
Is, on the sublease, I know we're leasing it for $1. on the sublease, is the sublease from the Development Authority going to be just an in-grant sublease to the prime developer, Pier Place LLC, which it looks like that's what it is, and they're setting the rates that they then do additional subleasing when they go to the proposals, or is the Development Authority itself going to hold as the agent and actually negotiate and set the fee structures for the rent of the square footage? I'm just trying to, and that'll probably be later, but I want to understand how the cost recovery and the profit and what comes back. I want to understand the business model of once it's subleased, what happens. And it's unclear to me that revenue flow and who gets to do what. That's all my questions, Mr. Mayor.
Thank you, sir. Any other questions or comments? Okay. Oh, John?
One of the things, Mr. Mayor, and I'd really like for us, you know, as we're taking a look at it, if we're going to build the pier, the public part of the pier as a public amenity, to be able to take a look at the fishing component, whether that's integrated in the top side or another level, to be able to potentially make that free to the public as well. And so I'd at least like to see the business case for why it would.
I think that's been part of the
Well, we're trying.
It says for fee on here.
Yes,
so.
sir, but we're trying to work out what the operating and maintenance, you want this thing to stay pristine as your preferred coastal city, and this is an amenity that we're trying to provide to our 15+ million that come here on an annual basis to compete against other coastal community resorts.
There may be a business reason why we can't, but I'd at least like to research on it.
Last question, I apologize. When we get to the point in this process that that the majority has chosen, where in here between the approval of the term sheet and lease, such that you can go now into the more detailed financial numbers, between there and when we have because we can stop this process anywhere along the way and not owe anybody anything.
Of course.
So where in between that and the final point, which is the heart of my resolution, do we have the economic analysis that tells us about displacement, all these things? When, I know that's coming, I just want to make sure that that's going to happen between when we do this one step, whatever date that is, and that last step where, you know, you do
Yes,
the
sir.
Magna Carta, sign your name, that we're going to have that information.
Mr. Moss, I reviewed the numbers today. Patty has included a 60% displacement factor, which is as high. It's, of course, a sliding scale. We are going to show the council their return on investment. We are baselining the current revenue stream, netting that out. We're going to net out displacement. We're going to net out public services, and we are going to take the most extreme risk-averse perspective here to lay those numbers out for the council.
All right, thank you very much.
Yes, sir.
One thing I would just say, and I appreciate your comments, Bobby, but some of that financial information is no different than what we did at the arena, that, you know, is not permitted to be put out at this time, just as it was in the arena process.
And that's why I kept my questions very few.
Thank you, but just want to, Mr. Moss even agreed, and I thank you for that. All right.
But we need to have them before we make a choice. But I do agree with Bobby, the process was not the right.
Okay. All right, we'll move on.
Yes, sir. Thanks, Ron.
Short-term rentals. And,
Okay. Barry Frankenfield is going to come in, if he's still out there, and he is going to present our planning commission's work. And I've told Barry to be ready to respond to your inquiries, and we're not making a decision tonight.
That's right.
We're setting so this is an information brief, and
but there's going to be one made pretty soon.
Good afternoon, Mayor, council members. We'll be giving you a brief on the short-term rentals, and those of you that don't know, we affectionately call that the STRs. So if you hear that acronym, that's what that's all about. And what happened on February 14th with the Planning Commission. We have here today with us our wonderful city attorney, Kay Wilson, who has been to every meeting on this issue in the last 2 years, Kevin Kemp, planning administrator, Carolyn Smith, Kathy Warren, I know I'm missing somebody, Eric Schmoody from the the Commissioner of Revenue's office is outside if we have any tough questions for him. Also, the chairman of the Planning Commission, Bob Thornton, is on his way. I suspect he's in the parking lot, but he will be in here shortly.
Well, we thank everyone for being over here and the hard work that's gone into this.
All right, just to remind you of where we've been, basically Beaches and Waterway Commission
looked into event houses. That became short-term rentals. That was August 2016. Ad hoc committee was looking at the state legislation for short-term rentals. Provided a report to council in November 2016. General Assembly passed legislation that allows localities to establish a registry for STRs and allows localities to adopt zoning ordinances and regulations. City of Virginia Beach provided an ordinance to comply with the General Assembly legislation. The Planning Commission finally calls that the Phil Kellum Ordinance. And then finally, you council referred some draft ordinances to the Planning Commission for 40 days consideration. Planning Commission looked at that December 13th and asked for an extension, which you gave to them. Again, just a simple reminder of where we are or were. Alternative 1, you got 3 ordinances, 3 alternatives. Alternative 1 was a short-term overlay district with conditional use permits outside of that district. Alternative 2 was if you registered prior to January 1st, 2017, the use is permitted as a grandfathering. After that point, you would require a conditional use permit after that date. Alternative 3, all short-term rentals are accessory use. They are permitted in all residential districts with conditions. Those were the 3 alternatives. When Bob gets here, he will tell you that the Planning Commission has never struggled in every one of theirs collective memory on something as complicated or difficult as this item. To prove that, they had 4 public workshops starting in December, December 4th, December 12th, before the 13th, January 25th, and February 5th. All those workshops are public. They were open to the public. They were advertised to the public. All the information handed to the Planning Commission was also made available to any public that attended, and those included letters and emails, and trust me, we have plenty of letters and emails. All the occupancy estimates, fees, any of the fees related to real estate companies, map of the STRs, which I've given you a new map, an updated map in your package, and I also have it in this presentation. We went over the special event fees and process. We talked about 311 calls for noise and parking. We went over numerous ordinances, the proposed ordinances that you asked them to review, as well as a couple alternatives that the Planning Commission came up with themselves. And we also went over the July 2017 city STR. The Planning Commission, December 13th, we had 37 speakers. All items were deferred and requested an extension, which I just talked about. On the February 14th, Planning Commission in an informal session discussed a substitute motion for Alternative 2. That's with conditional use permits. But they did as a group, regardless of their opinion on the alternatives, they came to consensus on the 13 conditions which are attached to that ordinance. I'll go over them. And there was a consensus on the Alternative 1, the overlay district. We had 28 speakers. It seemed like more, but we only had 28 that day. I will be getting you the verbatim transcripts for both informal and formal session. We have referred those to our contractor who will do all, both efforts. They should be done in the next couple days. If I don't have them to you by the end of the week, you will surely have them well in advance, the following week, in advance of the next public comment period. Speaker themes, oversimplification perhaps, but I'm not saying whether it was good or bad, but parking was a key issue. Some people like the one space per bedroom that is recommended in the draft ordinance. Other people didn't like it. Some people liked the one contract in 7-day period. Other people didn't like it. They wanted 2. Insurance requirement, we were all over the place, but concern that insurance should be required, and then a concern that it's none of our business to require insurance. They should be able to figure that out on their own. How do we do enforcement? How do we do inspections? Very good questions, which later on I will discuss that those are some of the things we will have to develop policies and procedures on regardless of what ordinance you approved. So we will have to figure out how we aggressively and efficiently regulate these uses. Clearly, throughout the process, one size does not fit all came up again and again. Because it might work in Sandbridge doesn't mean it'll work in the resort. Because it works in the resort doesn't mean it'll work at the north end. Because it works at the north end doesn't mean it'll work in Thalia. So there was many neighborhoods that felt there should be a clear distinction in how the ordinances are applied and how they are approached based on the, and this is the word from the brief, from the speakers, the nuances of the neighborhood. So there was much discussion on that. I think that hit a nerve or whatever with the Planning Commission. I think they were sensitive to that issue. However, I don't believe that the ordinance they recommend does that at this time. Oversimplification one more time. 3 strikes and you're out with adjudicated violations. That was either supported or not supported. The Planning Commission supported it within 2 years. That is basically referenced in the state code. It's referenced in the city code. We don't have much authority to deal with that or don't deal with that. It basically says 3 adjudicated violations may result in removal or removing that registry, that availability to register. Basically, of the 28 people that talked, I could summarize it into 2 comments. No STRs ever in my neighborhood. You need to have CUPs. And overregulation of any kind, including a CUP, will have significant financial consequences for us and the city of Virginia Beach. There was very little middle ground, as I could see, on what the discussion was. But we will provide you the verbatim, and you can decide for yourself. Repeating a little bit, on February 14th, the items related to overlay districts are referred to as D1, 2, and 3. That's an alternative 1. They were denied 11-0. Alternative D4, which was alternative 2, which was a alternative motion and proposed ordinance by the Planning Commissioners Ripley and Horsley, which basically said that conditional use permit and grandfathering was a reasonable alternative to regulating in all neighborhoods. D5 was alternative 3, and that is basically by right. STRs are by right in residential neighborhoods with registration and with conditions. And I'll go over the 13 conditions, and there was consensus on them regardless of whether whichever alternative was considered. So, alternative 3, the Planning Commission version is basically says STRs are permitted with conditions. That's short-term rentals, and I'll go over the conditions. Home sharing is permitted in all residential neighborhoods, and the requirement is much less. It is a registration. And home sharing is if you live in the home and you allow someone to stay in your home for a short term for whatever purpose. So that is the difference. And the Planning Commission pretty much felt that home sharing already had an owner on site monitoring the activity, and that would justify less regulation. These are the 13 conditions that were attached to the draft ordinance. Parking with a plan approved by the zoning administrator. Basically, it said that they had to have 1 parking space per unit. Stacking was permitted. So most of the houses we looked at in Sandbridge could easily meet that requirement. Rental units in the resort, probably not. As a compromise, the Planning Commission suggested, consistent with the form-based code in the oceanfront, that off-site parking would be permitted with the approval of the zoning administrator. Noise, there's some noise and traffic. There's some conditions that have been in all the ordinances. They are very general. Planning Commission was concerned that they were unenforceable. However, bottom line is they felt it was very important to make sure that these issues are open and addressed and made available. And that's no noise shall be created in excess of what normally is expected in a residential neighborhood, and no additional traffic shall be created in excess of what is normally expected in a residential neighborhood. So those are difficult items to measure, but they felt it was important to keep those requirements in there. Of all the surprises throughout this process was the lack of conflict over events. In all the ordinances and the Planning Commission ordinance, events are regulated as more than 50 people and less than 100 and requires a special event permit, and no more than 3 special events per year. The existing special event permit will have to process and ordinance will have to be revised to address this. Currently, the special events ordinance requires a special event permit in residential properties for over 150 people and outdoor amplified or live music. So this would be an adjustment as far as fairness. If you own your own home and you're living there and you want to have a party of 100 people, this STR limitation would not apply to you. It would only apply if you have a short-term rental. The contact information, telephone number, and emergency contact is to be provided. That's the wording on that. Signs 1 by 1 foot are permitted. Clearly, home signs, the name of your home, particularly in Sandbridge, would be exempted. So that item would be allowed to stay as it is. Let's see. So, registration with commissioner is required. Have to go to the commissioner's office. You have to pay a fee of $50. You have to show the information that's required. And that information is also shared with the planning and zoning department. They review it. If it's approved, it goes back to the commissioner of revenue. It's a fairly straightforward, very simple process. We do it all the time for building permits that have to have the designated zoning accompany that approval. Okay, we're moving right along here. Posting the ordinances. Oh, I missed the 3 strikes. That's where the 3 strikes and you're out, basically 3 violations, and you may have that registration pulled, and the term is 2 years of adjudicated violations. So that means you have to be convicted in 2 years, and then the commissioner may pull your registration. A very topic of a lot of discussion. Posting of the summary of ordinances is required. So no fires on the beach, whatever else is required by basic ordinances we want people to be aware of would have to be posted in the home. Refuse is in containers, not in bags. That's consistent with our current ordinances. Recommended 2 contracts in 7-day period. And that is one of the items of contention. So it would allow you to do a 3 or 4 day rental one weekend and a 3 or 4 day rental for the other weekend. Proof of liability insurance is required with a $500,000 liability insurance. Planning Commission did some research and they determined that they recommended that was the level, the minimum level that should be required. Occupancy limit, 3 per bedroom plus 2. We originally had 2 per bedroom plus 4. We went through various real estate companies and looked at the amount of people that were advertised to occupy those, and this is consistent with what we found on various websites. And finally, if there's any inspection of the city property that expected any sort of violation whatsoever, the owner would be notified and have 24 hours notice. All right, the map. Last time I made this presentation, we handed out a map, and you asked, could we get the map with the amount of short-term rentals in my district?
So this has, we don't show the district lines. This data is from the Commissioner of Revenue. This map is from the Commissioner of Revenue. It's a lot of personal financial and ownership information. So all we have is the map. But they did summarize for us a couple different things. They summarized the district, how many, and the winners are the beach and the Sandbridge, Princess Anne, who have almost 75% of the rentals. And then we have about, of all the 1,700 that are identified, that includes real estate companies, that includes online rentals that have registered, and that includes online rentals that are in the process of being researched by the contractor. So basically 1,143 are real estate companies, and 364 are active registered properties that are purely online rental. There are some discrepancies if you do the addition, but the contractor identifies specific properties, and they may or may not have finally been resolved to be registered or not registered. So there's some differences in the numbers. But I feel confident to tell you that in November we told you there was about 1,400, and now I'm telling you it looks like there's about 1,700. So that is a significant increase over 5 or 6 months. Okay. And this is where we're at, and these are some of the observations as staff that we have thinking about and that have been discussed is what are the unintended consequences of approving by right in residential districts. And that is that if you go back and change the regulations at some point, it's likely that then they will be non-conforming. So if you don't approve conditional use permits today, but in a year from now you say, all short-term rentals need to be conditional use permits, you can't take back the ones that you have approved. They will be non-conforming. I keep looking to see if our attorney is nodding at me, because I tend to oversimplify and exaggerate. I would never admit that. I guess I just did. All right, so the existing special event ordinance needs to be revised. We are fully prepared to do that. Kay is working on that. That will come forward regardless of, unless you tell us, but that has been part of every one of these ordinances. It seems to have support from the commercial real estate companies as well as the residential communities. I think there's a tremendous expectation of immediate enforcement. You approve an ordinance, got a new zoning regulation, everything's going to come in compliance right away. The reality is the zoning ordinance will require compliance, but I just want to tell you that it may be a little bit of a process here to make sure that we have everybody in compliance. All the registrations will be notified. I talked to Mr. Kellum this afternoon. Whatever regulations you propose, all the registered owners will be advised, and they will be advised that they will be in compliance with whatever registration whatever conditions you require. We expect, and we fully expect to implement this, but we look at a tremendous amount of coordination required with ECC 311, Commissioner's Office, Zoning, Special Events Office, Parking Office, Public Works Waste Management, and Police. However, I believe we've been having those discussions, and our effort and our commitment that we would deliver a seamless enforcement effort that included all these different groups to make sure that it is implemented correctly. You notice in there the Planning Commission recommendations said that the zoning administrator could determine whether the parking was in compliance. We are somewhat we will make that happen, but we are a little concerned that we want to make sure we have very clear guidelines, a very clear understanding of what that is before there's any misconception or concern from approval for those types of things. And we will also have that in place if you approve this. If you choose this option, we would have that in place also. The next steps, just to remind you, are the public hearing March 6th and public comment and vote on March 20th. If you want to go in that direction. With that, I will stop talking and we'll open that up to questions. Or does anybody from, Kay, do you have any comments or any concerns about what I just said?
I would like to
Okay.
make just
Okay,
one
all right. I saw him looking concerned about something, so.
Just in the discussion of the alternatives on page 3, I want to point out that alternatives 1 and 2 made a distinction between the home sharing and the short-term rental, and a conditional use permit under those alternatives was only proposed to be required for the short-term rentals, such that under those 2 alternatives, the home sharing would have been permitted by right. And that I just wanted to make sure that was clear for the public.
But the home sharing would have had conditions which were taken out by the planning commission, except for registry. So the home sharing that had those conditions, when you made the recommendations, the planning commission took all of those conditions out, except the condition that they register and pay taxes.
I believe that's correct.
I would really like to have those 3 ordinances back. I mean, I know I've got them somewhere, but in all this stuff, I may have trouble finding, because I think we have those 3 proposed ordinances plus this one at this point, so we can compare all of the things.
Okay, we got questions. Rosemary, then Lewis.
Yeah, I have 2 questions. I think there is some legislation in the General Assembly about the conditional use that's passed the House, but to not allow conditional use for short-term rentals.
The only bill that we know of that is pending in the General Assembly relates specifically to regulations imposed by the city of Lexington, and nowhere in that legislation is there reference to a conditional use permit.
I thought Barry Knight had a bill.
That is
Mr. Knight's bill.
Okay. Well, the other one is, since that one.
That was easy.
Yeah.
Thank you.
The other one is the 311. How does that, can you walk us through how that works? If
Sure,
somebody
unless
has a
Mr. Hanson
complaint
wants to
with-
do it. I'll be glad to,
House
okay,
next
all right.
door.
All right, so.
I'll help you out.
I mean,
So all the
we need a
commission,
reporting process
right, all the
or somebody-
commissioner revenue data is shared with 311. So somebody dials 311 and said, I'm having a problem with 207 Swordfish. I just happen to remember that from this weekend. So 311 looks it up and says, that is a certain realty company, contact is so-and-so. The 311 would call the contact, we have this problem, can you fix it, yes or no. Can't be fixed, it goes to 911, calls the police are dispatched to address the issue. So there could be there could be different levels of emergency here. You know, one could be trash is sitting out in the street as opposed to, you know, underage drinking and a whole lot of people hanging out in the street. So, but it would start at 311. We would make sure that zoning, commissioner revenue, all that data is shared into one database and is clearly understood who the contact is, who the agency is, who the rental agency is, and then make the call whether it transitions to 911.
And how does that convert to declaring a violation?
Now I need the city attorney.
Let me
Okay.
try, and Kay will fix me when I get it wrong.
I just, need to understand how this all
What
works.
the way it is proposed in, I think, the recommended ordinance is it must be 3 convictions. So if there's a call to 311 and the owner can take care of it, it stops there. If there's a call to 311 and the owner chooses not to or can't take care of it, then it would go to the police. The police have a policy of trying to get a voluntary compliance. If they can get voluntary compliance, it ends there. If they can't get voluntary compliance, they could write, if it's a criminal violation, a summons. It would then go through the court process. If it's dismissed in the court process, it would end there. Only if there is a conviction does that count as 1, and then you would rinse, repeat that entire process 3 times in 2 years.
Okay, got Lewis next, please, and then Jim Wood.
I'd like a little further explanation of that first observation. Unintended consequences. Uses allowed by right become non-conforming if regulations change. Does that mean if any regulations change? Does that mean only if what the planning commission recommended changes
What,
occur, or what does that exactly mean?
if someone approves, being you, approves STRs by right in the residential areas without a conditional use permit, without an overlay, then if a year from now, you decide that that wasn't the right approach, that you want conditional use permits or some other more stringent regulatory approach, and you change the regulation, then you can't go back and take that away from the people you approved.
But if we,
Why not?
if we,
So we want to make that clear, you can't.
if we approve an ordinance that changes anything from the way it is right now, does that apply?
We're going to, go ahead.
That's
We-
right. Well, it doesn't apply because short-term rentals.
Thank you.
Because short-term rentals are not allowed in the city at this time. In order to be non-conforming, to have these vested rights, you had to have been permitted when you started. So if we say, okay, we're going to grandfather all those people, if we use alternative 2, if we wanted to go back and make them get conditional use permits, we can't because we permitted them, and now we can't change the zoning ordinance on them.
But Kay, I think the question's slightly different, if I may
My
help.
question's different than that.
Okay.
My question is, if we pass an ordinance, does that automatically grandfather all of the people who are now doing short-term rentals?
They would be governed by the provisions and conditions that you approved at the time you approved it. And if you changed conditions, those changed conditions would apply only to people who came after that point.
If we change conditions subsequent to the approval of the ordinance?
Right.
Is that
Yes,
right?
yes.
But everybody in the city at this point does not become non-conforming when you pass an ordinance. They are
Okay,
going to have
that's
to
what I
abide.
That's
Okay.
what I wanted to know. Thank
Yes.
you, Kay.
If I could follow up on that point, because you were answering a question that I had earlier about vested rights. And you made, in your answer, you've made that comment. But then you say changes to any conditions imposed on the home sharing or short-term rental activity or any effort to eliminate these uses entirely in any zoning district would be subject to vested rights claims. So if we adopt this proposal that makes it a principal use in all residential categories, we are vesting that right in those all residential categories. If we were next year saying we don't want that anymore and we attempted to remove that, it would be subject to vested rights.
And that's why they would be non-conforming uses, because they have a vested right to continue under the approval that you gave.
Well, is the vested right only get created when they register? Because it's a zoning ordinance, or is the vested right with the zoning of the land independent of their registration to exercise the right they were granted under the land? You make it sound like there's a grandfathering, but to me, if it's zoning, zoning is the land whether you use the right or not.
No, in order to have a vested right, you have to have taken an action in reliance on the governmental act. That taking that action and expending money in reliance is what causes you to have a vested right.
Yeah, but, so if someone bought a piece of property under the current zoning, which doesn't provide that as a primary use, and they've exercised that right to have that, to protect them against a use that wasn't provided for, do they then have a vested right being injured if we change it? Because now their vested right has been materially changed, and they can show consequential material damages in terms of the valuations that they've now been injured by our change?
I don't believe the vested right analysis would work that way.
No, it wouldn't work that way because you have to be at allowed use to begin with. And so right now, nobody is an allowed use.
But if we change a use,
Okay.
You don't have, I don't believe you have a vested right as to somebody else's use next to you. That's essentially, I think, what you're getting at.
no,
Maybe,
that's
Mr.
not what
Moss, I
I
don't
do.
know.
Okay,
your
well then I
question.
misunderstand your question.
But I don't want to protract it here because I'm sure some lawyers will be engaging us on it.
Okay, I mean,
All right. Well, Jim was been waiting patiently, then Shannon, I got you next.
Can you go back to the penalty or the violation page, just one of them? I'm looking through this Planning Commission Alternative 3, which presumably this is what their recommendation is. This is the ordinance, okay. But then you talk about, where is it? No, the 3 strikes, 2 years. Okay, what violations are those? The violations aren't enumerated in here. Doesn't say what it is. Is it noise generally? Is it disorderly conduct, drunk in public?
It's any federal, state, or local ordinance or regulation that essentially relates back to the short-term rental.
Okay, well, so here's my question. First, I don't think that's defined well enough. I think it needs to be defined what the violations are. I think this opens us up to wild interpretation of it. Second, frankly, I think 3 strikes is too generous. I certainly think 2 years is too generous, because if you've got a house next to you and there is a problem going on, you call the police show up, they gain voluntary compliance, great, then that noisy party's over. 3 days later, new officer comes by, same thing. Well, that doesn't help the people who are living next door, who are having to deal with this. So that's a problem with it. So frankly, I think it needs to be spelled out. I think it needs to be very specific what the ordinances are. I think people need to understand they're responsible for the people that are in that house, they're responsible for their actions. I'd like to see, Mark, and I don't know how possible this is, if there is the ability that we can enact a specific ordinance for this, where the penalty might not necessarily be a monetary fine or 10 days in jail or whatever, but the penalty is you can't do this. You know, if they do this, then they're right to do this. And I don't know if there's a civil process where that could go, but I think that's what needs to happen, because at the end of the day, the most important part about this is protecting the existing neighborhoods. That is the most important thing, protecting people who live there year round and all that. So while I think it's a great idea to have a concept where there are a series of strikes, I think that's asking people to deal with a heck of a lot, because you can have huge parties every day of the week. You can have a different officer come by every day of the week who gives you a break and does it. I mean, we saw the presentation of the police chief. They're writing fewer and fewer summonses because they're getting voluntary compliance. That's not a bad thing, but it's a bad thing if there's no consequence to you. So I think that needs to be.
I'm going to go to Shannon next, and Jim, I agree with what you just said.
So we can't go back if we grant whichever.
You can go back. It just has a consequence.
Exactly.
Okay.
Well, what if the state were to pass something stricter next year, we would have to abide by what the state mandates at that point, right?
Probably, yes.
So they could control it if
the state comes out and next year there's a bill that says cities do not have the zoning power to have CUPs for short-term rentals, then when that passed and became effective July 1, we'd have to meet the state code.
Under Dillon's rule, we always have to.
Got Barbara next, then Jessica.
I just wanted, because I have several other things later, but I'll let others talk in the meantime, but on this point of the complaints, the original recommendations that came from the city attorney's office provided that there would be an agent or a contact with the authority to compel compliance with the rental agreement must be identified and be able to be present on the site within 30 minutes of being contacted. Well, that was taken out by the Planning Commission. So the only thing that's required is a telephone number or other information for an emergency contact shall be provided. But it doesn't say they have to do anything. You can call somebody and they don't have to respond. So what is going to be the enforcement? Is it still back on the police department to enforce? And I remember hearing a precinct captain 2 years ago when we started this say, we're not zoning enforcement officers. So, you know, if we're putting it back on the police department, that's not where it should be. So if there's not going to be a requirement that when there is a complaint, somebody must respond within a reasonable length of time, you know, we really haven't done anything.
Didn't we talk about that before?
Yeah, but that was taken out by the Planning Commission.
Okay, all right, got it.
Jessica?
There's a difference between, if I could just follow up real quick, there's a difference between violating zoning and violating
Absolutely.
crime.
Well-
And so, I mean, if there's a wild party going on,
Then you
they're
don't
not
call
gonna
the
call the
police.
zoning guys.
But that's what everybody would say, okay, if it's some of the things that could have happened last Friday night happened, then you call the police. But if it's just parking, then you can probably call 311, and then they will ask that the contact person go down and get cars moved. So that you're not requiring the police to go down there every time there's a little bit of noise or something.
Jessica, do you have a question?
I do. I have a question about 11, the proof of liability insurance. Are we going to make a material difference between rental premise liability insurance, or are they going to just be required to prove that they have a personal liability coverage of some kind? Because there is an issue from the insurance perspective of what would be covered in the event of a liability, and you know, on a typical homeowner's policy, if the provider that's providing your homeowner's insurance is unaware that you're using this for commercial use, you're not covered. And I think that leads people to believe that they're purchasing something that they don't have, that they're purchasing something that doesn't actually give them any protection, and then we're just a false requirement, really.
I don't think they made the distinction. Planning Commission did not see that distinction. Would you agree, Barry?
I would totally agree.
That they didn't see that distinction. We had made it, in the original drafts, it was $1 million, and that would have been a rental policy.
Right.
I think
Okay.
the original draft made reference to applicable to the rental activity. I believe the original draft.
So, well, then in that case, I think that it should probably be specifically outlined that the applicant is going to be required to get a rental premise liability coverage, because a personal liability policy could exclude any kind of coverage in the event of a claim.
Rental premise.
So, that's just a thought.
I want to just piggyback, because I know when you register your car every year, you know, they say, do you have insurance? But your insurance company notifies DMV the minute you cancel your policy. If they don't get notified by someone else, they say either show me proof of your thing or mail in your tags, you know.
Or pay $500.
All right, whatever. So my point here is, and that's why I think before we ever vote, I think council has to have the full set of whatever thing we think we're gonna adopt and want the public to comment on. I think we need not to just have this. I think we need to have the full set of implementing rules and regulations so that when we vote, we're not voting like up in Congress, they vote a bill and then pass it off to someone else who writes all the regulations, and now I'm living with the consequences. I didn't know what I bought into. I want to see, you know, A through Z, and if it's voluminous, I don't want to be voting before I know what I'm imposing. But I do think it's going to be important when people come to get the registration, whatever process we take, that they have to have the proof that they have whatever liability we say we're having. Because in the end, this is about not giving people a false sense of security. I know we have had not very much good success enforcing noise. That's been, so I don't know that by putting that up there, I never believe in giving people false hope. I mean, I think you got to be honest with people, unless we are really going to say when you come in for your parking thing, we're going to find out how many cars are registered at that address. We got the dimensions of your driveway, and you already have what the number is. So when someone comes in and says you know the answer, so it's a very mathematical, non-discretionary act. When it comes to traffic, I don't know what that means, and if we can't define it, we shouldn't include it, because you're not going to be able to go to court and enforce anything or take something away that you've granted on a very ambiguous expectation. It won't work, and I think Mark would concur with that. So let's make sure that whatever we do, that we know what the legally enforceable action is, what the legally enforceable means to apply that language so that we can hold people accountable to it. And if we had to go to court, or however the state law requires, what would be the conditions of evidence that we would have to be able to present to make it work, and does our process and does our language deliver that outcome? Because that's the only way you're going to get back to Jim's expectation of whatever you adopt, that you can tell neighborhoods, we are protecting you against an unintended consequence or an irritant in your neighborhood, versus they're an irritant, but what we've adopted doesn't give us any way to judicially remove it, because people are going to obviously contest and protect their property rights we should expect that, and our track record on traffic and noise is not good. So if we're gonna do it, then we have to have a way, and then what's the cost? I don't wanna put a burden on the staff that we don't resource, because that just creates friction, and we shouldn't consciously be putting these people in charge of expectations that when we adopted them, we know we couldn't meet, because that's where the friction is. The citizens don't bang, well, they will bang on us too, but the first place that takes that heat is the first line city employee, and they deserve better. We shouldn't put them in that spot. I'm just asking that whatever we do, that we have the full compendium and we understand the metrics of how we would enforce it, because then citizens are gonna know, and then we're gonna get, Mr. Mayor, I think, the best feedback as to what people think. And I don't think this yet, but good work on the planning commission's part. They gave them a tough problem, and I think you'd have to be Solomon plus to come up with the answer that makes everybody happy, but we ought to know it's an answer that we can really enforce.
Rosemary.
I just have a question that we put in place that you had to register. It's a short-term rental. If you didn't register, we first said it was a $1,000 fine, and then the General Assembly changed it to a $500 fine. So when you're saying they're not allowed, I'm confused. If we don't allow them, why did we have a registration process?
I think I need the city attorney. You want to answer this? The registration process is in place.
The registration process is for the payment of transient occupancy taxes. And people pay their taxes whether they're legal or not. They pay their taxes because of the transient occupancy. They do not get a business license, because that would have to be signed off by zoning, and zoning cannot sign it because they are not legal.
This is like in the old days requiring people who sold marijuana to get a business license so they can turn around and convict them.
So they're not allowed, but they have to register.
All right, Louis and then Barbara.
Pay their taxes.
All right. Can we pass an ordinance that imposes the necessity of a conditional use permit in one section of the city, but not in other sections of the city?
You can do that by zoning district. If you could figure out, is it R10, R12, that kind of thing. You can do it that way. You can do it by overlay. But you can't take an ordinance and say it's only going to apply in these specific little enclaves unless you do an overlay, because zoning ordinances have to be uniform across the same kind of place.
Barbara?
Well, I guess I've had a lot to say, because it did sort of originate with something that I brought forward 2.5 years ago, and it's gone on for quite a long time. But I was at the Sandbridge Civic League meeting last night, and there was a lot of discussion there, and I just kind of was thinking that this might be a good feedback for just a general idea of what that particular community was talking about. They were talking a lot about this parking, and of course these comments were coming more from the people who were involved because they were doing this and wondering how they were going to do it. But the question, I think the original ordinance required that the parking be on site, or at least your proposal. But now, if parking does not have to be on site, then that means it's from the public, and public parking, either on-street parking or some public parking lot, in all probability. And I think I know we had an email from a company that's building some townhouses down at the ocean front, and I think that email came to us January 23rd. I looked back, 31st. They were asking, okay, they're building these townhouses, but they're building them for short-term rentals, but they are concerned about how they're going to meet the parking, and say, well, we could refer them to public parking. Now, my question is, if we are going to start having the public parking spaces being required to provide parking for the short-term rentals, how is that going to affect us in what we're trying to do in providing public parking? I don't expect an answer today, but this was certainly a question that had a lot of discussion last night. But if it's going to be not on-site, and if it's going to be some part of public parking, how is that going to be handled with all of the other public parking we require? Of course, this is kind of like, if we have a hotel, I guess a hotel has to provide a certain number of spaces, and you have to provide it. And then that gets into the other things that I think the ad hoc committee had a lot of concern about, was having a level playing field. Because, if all of these properties, when they were built that we're considering, on their building permit said it was for a single-family residence. And so therefore, they only were required to meet the building codes for residential. If they were lodging units, they would have been bumped into another category and would have had to meet other building code requirements, primarily the fire codes. So, at some point, we kind of have to recognize that, if we're going to recognize residential units as lodging units, there are a lot of unintended consequences, or it's really, it bumps up against a lot of other things that are going on or not going on. John, I've got other things, but I'll let you interrupt.
No, I was just trying to get Will's attention. I didn't want to interrupt.
I got it.
No, I thought you had a
No,
comment about
go ahead,
that.
go ahead, I'm sorry.
Another thing that they did talk about, of course, was this enforcement and taking out the requirement that there be a contact person named who, not just a number, but a contact person named who would be responsible for seeing that the complaint is addressed in a reasonable length of time. And we've talked about that somewhat as well. And then, of course, when we got to this whole question, and there were folks who were quite concerned that we were taking away some property right that they have now because we are attempting to regulate. And when I said, well, you don't have the right now because it's not legal, that didn't sit very well. But, when you tell people something they don't want to hear, it's not always good. But we do get into this whole thing of, well, you're taking away my property rights simply because people have been doing weekly rentals for a long time. But I think the thing that's changed is that in the last few years, those weekly rentals have gone to these 2- and 3-day rentals and so forth. And I think that's what has caused a lot of problem. Plus the advent now of Airbnb and the other platforms, which of course allow anything to be rented for any length of time. And so, this whole question does get into a lot of folks' mind about whether or not we're interfering with some property rights that have been perceived to have had. But I'm concerned too that we are conveying rights. And if we convey this right to everybody in the city who has a residential unit at all zoning categories, we're conveying an awful lot. And I really worry that we may find out that we have gone a little bit too far, and pulling back may get to be a problem. Another question that came up last night was this question of the number of bedrooms. And of course, our ordinance in no way says how many bedrooms a house can have, because remember, these are all permitted as a residential unit. And a residential unit doesn't specify you can only have a certain number of bedrooms. And I believe it was the president last night who made an observation, his observation, that 20 years ago the city council did not impose a number of bedrooms, and so now we're stuck with whatever there can be. There's no way to determine how many bedrooms there can be. But one of the questions I had asked, and I asked the city attorney's office to respond, because I was concerned, I am concerned about in the agricultural area, because this applies to the agricultural area. Right now, how big a single-family residence can get is dictated by the requirements in the ordinance for that particular category: setbacks, height, lot coverage, and impervious cover. And then they can get as many bedrooms on there as they can, as long as they meet those criteria. But when you get into an area like the agricultural area that has a minimum lot size of 1 acre, but most people have 5 acres or 40 acres or something, you could have a pretty daggone big bedroom or a house with a lot of bedrooms, but we have no way of controlling that number because we don't have any, if somebody fills it out, that application, and checks the box that this is a single-family residence, which they all do, then that's how it's coded, and that's how the building requirements are made, and There's no limit to the number of bedrooms. So this could be an unintended consequence that we are imposing on somebody in the future. Another thing in discussion, because there was some confusion that we started out only talking about event houses, and now we're talking about short-term rentals. But of course, event houses, any house can be an event house. And like I say, the thing that arose last weekend, that mansion party was in a 2,700 square foot house if it had not been stopped in time. So it's not the size of the house. It's the fact that people have these parties. And the police precinct captain last night did make the comment that, we do this commercial activity, pay for play is going to be something we're going to have to watch out for, because that one last weekend was $10 and $15 at the door. So, we're charging, it's pay for play. This kind of thing is happening, will continue to happen, and I can guarantee you most of these events will have less than 50 people. There are going to be a lot of events with 49 people, which would then be unregulated, no permit. And, when we are doing this and we're imposing this on the entire city, everybody in a residential category, I think these unintended consequences can be pretty high. I notice also that there had been a requirement that the exits be clearly marked, and that was something that was taken out by the Planning Commission. This is, I think, extremely important when you're looking at a place when people are going to be sleeping in a house that they're not familiar with. And I know we have gotten emails from people who say, well, I don't have to have my house, my exits marked in my house, and I live there and it's perfectly safe. But if you have people living in a house that they're unfamiliar with, you've got 30 people in that house, they're not familiar with it, and there's a fire at 2 o'clock in the morning, and everybody's partied a little bit too much, they may not be able to find all of the exits. And I think we have not provided to have the fire requirements that they don't have to have sprinklers, because no house has to have sprinklers. I really think we have to look at all of these other things, and I could go on for a long time, but we do have a lot of things that we have to touch on. There are a lot of unintended consequences that we could precipitate, and I think, we have to do the best we can to anticipate all of them, and that's why I'm afraid of an overreach at this point.
Thank you very much. I've got John Earn, and then we'll wind this up.
I do want to point one thing out. Barbara, you'd raised the issue about event houses and if they're charging admission. You guys passed a law a couple of years ago when we were having these rave parties that were showing up in warehouse districts and stuff. The police have the authority that if somebody's charging admission, to prove that they've registered with the commissioner's office and they're getting the tax. If they're not getting the tax, they can shut it down and then they can write a citation.
Right, and I believe the precinct captain last night said that he had to, before he could shut this one down last Thursday, he had to assess the risk and determine whether or not there was some risk before it could be shut down. So I
understand, but they do have a vehicle to shut it down if they so choose, if they're charging admission.
I want to know all that stuff before we adopt this thing, because I think, and it's not hypothetical. It's not hypothetical that this might happen. It did happen in Virginia Beach in April of 2016 in a townhouse that was rented through Airbnb, and there was a party, and a 20-year-old ODU student was killed, and his name was Darren Campbell. And so we're not talking about hypothetical. We're talking about something that actually happened. Now, when that occurred, and it turned out that the owner was in China, he had no idea this was going on in his house, well, we were all surprised. I pulled up the newspaper article and reread it last night just because I was shocked at that. And that headline said, Virginia Beach is looking at Airbnb rentals, and this was 2 years ago. But anyway, that happened, and we didn't realize it could happen. And as I said before, now we know it. And, it's the old, what did you know and when did you know it? We now know these things can happen. And I think we cannot pretend that it won't and not consider these things when we're considering this action. I think we have to know what can happen, and I think we have to to make sure we're doing our best, because our responsibility, as Jim said, is to the neighborhoods and the people around it, not just to that property owner and how much money he may or may not make.
Okay, John, and then we'll wind up.
I'll ask later. It was a technical parking question.
Okay.
I'll do it later.
Very good.
Mr. Mayor, would you mind if Mr. Thornton made a quick comment? He drove all the way down here.
quick comment
I'm
would
sure
be
he wants
appreciated.
to say something.
Remember when I was here last, I told you all that this was a very complicated matter that didn't have a simple solution? Well, I hope you all appreciate that. We've probably got 25 hours of work into this with the Planning Commission, and basically, you know, we looked at it. You can impose a CUP on every house in Virginia Beach. You can create, which we didn't think was reasonable for the vast majority of the houses that are already existing. You can have overlay districts, which we felt like are going to create class warfare, because somebody on one side of the street can do it, on the other side of the street they can't. And we felt like having it as an accessory use with as many limitations as we can possibly come up with. Everything you all have talked about tonight, we processed in great length. Amount of insurance, exit signs. I mean, these are things that sound good, but they're virtually impossible to regulate or enforce. You're going to have people going in people's houses looking for lighted or unlighted battery-powered exit signs. And so it got to the point where we tried to keep it as reasonable and as simple as we could. And so we appreciate you all letting us do this, and we're glad that we've moved it to your end of the field instead of ours. And
we thank you for we thank you all for y'all's hard work. Shannon, and then we'll wind up.
Mr. Thornton, I had a question for you. Barbara had mentioned earlier, number 5, contact information. Obviously, it's proposed that they would have to give contact information, but it was removed by the Planning Commission that they had to respond within 30 minutes. What was the justification to removing that requirement?
Well, the practical side of it is, if you own a house and you're in Florida on vacation and somebody calls you, you can't be there in 30 minutes. And so if you live in the house, if it's home sharing, that's one thing. If you own these houses that are being proposed in the oceanfront area, the owners of these people are nowhere near. I mean, they might not even live in Virginia Beach. So back to the unintended consequences. If you put a requirement in there that the owner be on site in 30 minutes, that's not likely to happen. I mean, it could happen, but we felt like if you have the name of the person that owns it and a phone number or a way to text them or email them, the best you can do is get in touch with them. If they can get there, they can get there. If they can't, they're not going to be there if they're not in town. So
I thought our intention was to have a local person that they could
that
reach
was
out to.
something we did.
And the people that put these houses in with the real estate companies
You're
in
exactly right,
Sandbridge,
Shannon.
they're all required to do that anyway. The vast majority of the places in Sandbridge are handled by a real estate company, and there is somebody within a few minutes away. But the ones that don't work that way are people that put their private residence in Airbnb, and they leave and go to Maine for the summer. And so we didn't have an answer for you, but to make somebody be on site in 30 minutes is probably not practical.
Okay, very good. We thank you so very much, and we'll move on now. Thank you for y'all's hard work, everyone that participated on this. And Jim, what I'm taking to heart, this agenda, we shouldn't have had one thing on. We'd had more time. We are going to be a little bit short for time, so if anything comment-wise, I welcome. I'm not trying to cut anyone off, but if we can make it quick. Any comments?
I'll pass. I'll wait for the next.
That's very nice of you. Okay, on the formal session, let me just say to you that, Mr. Vice Mayor, we do have speakers on items number 6 and 10. And then we have Barbara Messer speaking on the public hearing number 2. And then on ordinances 2, 5, 6, which is already there, 7, 8, 10, which is already there, and 12. So, council, anybody want to put the rest on consent?
Sure.
Go ahead.
I do have an add-on. resolution that I think you all have copies of. This is not
10,
a substitute resolution. This is to be an add-on. This is something that I have suggested several times. I brought it up at the retreat. But I really think, and looking at our citizen survey saying that we don't give enough opportunity for civic engagement, and this concern that maybe we have not allowed enough civic engagement, particularly on these oceanfront projects, this resolution would do what I have sort of been saying, that we direct the city manager to hold a public input session in the coming weeks at the convention center for the Dome site in January. But this would be addressing the 15th Street Pier project, the Dome site, proposed sports center, and potential parking solutions, and have information about the projects and how they will act, so that we can have feedback from our citizens and an opportunity to learn more about the projects and provide valuable input to the city council and city planners about future development of the oceanfront. I think it's very important that we open this to anybody who wants to participate, anybody that wants to ask questions, anybody that wants to give us suggestions, and I think we need to look at the whole picture of all of these things, and that's what this resolution
So you're
would do.
requesting that as an
So
add-on?
I would request this be an add-on.
Okay, we'll put that on. We'll have to have 8 votes up front there, Mr. Vice Mayor. Mr. Moss.
One comment. First of all, I endorse the concept. My concern is that we yet don't have the body of information that adequately defines the projects to get meaningful input, so we're gonna have to have multiple ones of those.
Absolutely.
And we need to disclose people what that we can't tell them yet, so it's not like they think they know the project, because we heard today there's a lot of ambiguity. We're a long way from knowing the financial impact. But I'm not opposed to it, but it shouldn't be the only one. We really need to have that financial analysis.
Right, but I think we also have to have it, even though we can't answer all the questions, we need to have this early enough so that people can have input. If we wait until we can answer all the questions, they say, well, it's already a done deal, it's too late.
It's like
So I
Bob and I
think
did
it
with
should
the
be
arena.
early.
We had some information, we didn't have it all, but we still had a meeting. I think it's a great idea.
I have no problem with Mrs. Henley's add-on. I think it would be complementary to what John and I are trying to do in terms of, you know, giving the public confidence in terms of the information that we have is valid and objective and everything. I really see this as a complementary, you know, to what we're doing.
So we're okay with item number 1 being on consent? Item number 3 being on consent? Item number 4 being on consent? Item number 9 being on consent? Item number 11 being on consent? And 13 being on consent? And, well, that on, we got to do 8 votes.
We have to
first.
vote to add it on,
Yes,
but
ma'am.
then it can be on consent.
Does anyone object to that on consent? Okay, great.
Just do have one comment if I could, Mr. Mayor. And
Sure.
it's not because I'm not voting, but on item 5, I just want to make sure that we have provisions that none of the money that we give to Lynn Haven now, that we can segregate, that they're not using this for political advocacy or holding political forums for candidate forums. They shouldn't be using city money, even if they think that's educational. It might be, but it's still a political event. I just want to make sure they're not using city money to sponsor, whether it's a candidate forum, but they're not in the business of political advocacy with our money.
Very good. All right. That being said, I think we're good. The chair will entertain a motion to recess into a closed session pursuant to exemptions from open meetings allowed by Section 2.2-3711A Code of Virginia as amended for the following purposes: legal matters, consultation with legal counsel and briefings by staff members or consultants pertaining to actual or probable litigation where such consultation or briefing in an open meeting would adversely affect the negotiation or litigating posture of the public body, in consultation with legal counsel employed or retained by a public body regarding specific legal matters requiring the provision of legal advice by such counsel pursuant to Section 2.2-3711A7, immigration issue. Security matters, discussion of reports or plans related to the security of any governmental facility, building, or structure, or the safety of persons using such facility, building, or structure pursuant to Section 2.2-3711A19. Personnel matters, discussion, consideration, or interviews of prospective candidates for employment, assignment, appointment, promotion, performance, demotion, salaries, disciplining, or resignation of specific public officers, appointees, or employees of any public body pursuant to Section 2.2-3711A1, council appointments, council boards, commissions, committees, authorities, agencies, and appointees, council appointee evaluations. Do I have a motion?
So moved.
Second.
Have a motion and a second. Call the roll, please.
Henley?
Did you say Henley already?
Ms. Henley, yeah, Mr. Dyer,
Mr. Moss?
Aye.
Mr. Davenport? Ms. Abbott?
Aye.
Ms. King?
Aye.
Mr. Ernst? Mr. Wood?
Aye.
Ms. Wilson?
Aye.
Vice Mayor Jones?
Aye.
Mayor Stefan?
Aye. Very good.
Will you pull that door?